Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's Cyber Readiness webinar. And of course, today is the second in the series. I'm Collins Rex. I'm the lead for the Victorian Met's Export Hub, and I'm delighted to be your presenter today. And I'm with you today, not just in my capacity as lead of the hub, but also as Australia's first Cyber Readiness Institute certified cyber readiness coach. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, which for me is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islanders people who might be joining us on today's webinar. So let's have a look at what we're going to be covering today. Initially, we're going to do a quick recap of cyber readiness and exactly what that is. And then we're going to delve into the Core Four that we mentioned briefly in our first webinar. And the Core Four, of course, being passwords and multi-factor authentication, software updates, phishing, USBs, and secure file sharing. And then we're going to do a bit of a recap of all the above, and happy as always to take questions. Just type those in the Q&A box and I will keep half an eye on those as we move through today's webinar. So let's get straight into it, shall we? What is cyber readiness? So of course, cyber readiness is not about technology as such, it's about changing human behavior. So cyber readiness is taking practical steps to prevent cyber attacks by focusing on human behavior that is related to 4 core issues. It's also all about knowing what to do if an incident occurs and then responding appropriately to any breach, because of course, with the best will in the world, we can't prevent every attack that could come our way. So the approach that we take in this webinar series is that all-important focus on human behavior. We use guidance and tools on preventative measures and practical incident responses, and we help you to create a cyber readiness culture in your organization, irrespective of the size of that organization. And it is also very important that as part of this series, we get you to commit to supply chain security. And in our first session, we discussed at some length why it is important for you as a link in that all-important supply chain to be cyber ready. Now, if you are going to be building a cyber ready culture, and that's really what you should be aiming for, the goal is to embed cyber readiness in the way every single person in your organization does their job. People are absolutely key. And again, we discussed in our first session how you can have the greatest software in the world, you can have all the antivirus protection, but it's the wetware, it's the people that potentially cause the problems. Processes need to be practical and simple, because the more complicated things are, the more long-winded they are, the more likely it is that people will circumvent them. And technology needs to enhance cybersecurity, but it also needs to enable job performance. And again, if anything that you've installed in your network purely from a security perspective makes it difficult for people to do their day-to-day job, or it makes it take too long, again, there is an incentive to circumvent the security measures. If you are cyber ready, it will help you to gain a competitive advantage, because multinational companies definitely evaluate the data protection and cybersecurity programs of potential suppliers and channel partners, and this is happening on an increasing basis. Investors also conduct due diligence before they'll invest in you, and that means that they also look at how cyber secure you are. They don't want the hard-earned dollars that they put into the business to be stolen. And of course, cyber security protocols are key to ESG compliance. Now, we touched on the 4 core. Now, today we're going to delve into the Core Four in more detail. And of course, just to recap, the Core Four being passwords and multi-factor authentication, software updates, phishing, and USBs and file sharing. Not enough is being done to protect the 4 core, or indeed to make people aware of these major 4 issues. So when we look at passwords, 4 out of 5 data breaches result from weak or stolen passwords. 77% of attacks exploited gaps in software already on computers, which is why software updates are so important. 91% of all cyber attacks start with a phishing email, and that's why your staff needs to be educated about phishing. And 27% of malware infections originate from infected USBs. A survey was conducted by AdvisorSmith last year on over 1,000 SMEs, and you can see the stats there. Only 21% implemented strong password policies. Only 20% implemented multi-factor authentication, 16% implemented data encryption, 16% purchased cybersecurity software, which is a horrific statistic, and 16% regularly train their employees on cybersecurity, and only 9% hired a cybersecurity consultant. So I want you to think about some of the core issues that you'll be facing in your own organization. If you were to ask your workforce today if they could name and briefly explain the core 4, what percentage of them would be able to do that? And even if they couldn't call them the core 4, if you asked your staff what the major issues are that can affect cybersecurity in your business, how many of them would identify those 4 issues? And how is your workforce placed when it comes to their own responsibility for cyber readiness in your organization? Are they aware of that at all? Are they sort of aware, or are they absolutely unaware of it? That's a very important question for you to answer, because that is going to speak to how you're going to approach getting a cyber readiness culture in your organization. Now, the best way for you to get your team to take up the policies around the Core 4 is to appoint one person to become a cyber leader if your organization is a small one, or one person per department or division if your organization is large. If one person is responsible for educating your team and for keeping an eye on how things work, that one person becomes a conduit and a channel, and it's a lot easier to keep a handle on things. Of course, that does mean that you will have to empower that cyber leader to educate the team and then to enforce any cyber readiness policies. And that means from top to bottom. So let's look now in more detail at passwords and multi-factor authentication. So a password, of course, is a series of letter, number, symbols. It's the way a device knows who you are. So your device identifies you based on the password that you have inserted. It is the key, essentially, into any device. It's a very important gatekeeper to your data and your systems, and it is the most common way to authenticate your identity. It is also, unfortunately, also the most common way to steal your identity and gain access to your systems. Increasingly, passwords are being used in conjunction with multi-factor authentication, which can also be called two-step verification, and more about MFA in a moment or 3. So if we look at passwords and we look at how much time it takes for a hacker to brute force your password, it really does make a big difference whether the password is long or short, and whether the password consists of numbers only, letters only, etc. And if you look at the number of characters, if it's numbers only, in fact, if it's any of the above, it can be broken almost instantly by a brute force hack. As you increase the number of characters, it gets considerably more difficult. And the more characters you introduce into your password, including things like upper and lowercase letters and symbols, you can see that by the time you get to 18 characters, well, no hacker is going to bother to try to break that one, because there are easier ones to get into. Now, according to Microsoft, 99% of account compromise attacks can be blocked by implementing multi-factor authentication. So if you are looking at a password combined with MFA, how do you go about implementing that multi-factor authentication? First of all, start with your admin accounts. At a minimum, you want to use MFA on all your admins, so start with those privileged users. Admin accounts are also your highest value targets because they also provide the most access into your system. But they're also a really good way for you to test proof of concept. Then also look at those key business roles that are most likely to have an impact if they are accessed. Unauthorized access of people like your CEO or your CFO or any other senior leaders are far more likely to have an impact, because if those accounts are compromised and employees receive phishing emails from those accounts, they are far more likely to respond than if the email comes from somebody that is not in a position of authority in your business. Once you've tested and you've identified those key roles, you can then plan for wider deployment. And that means you need to start looking at the systems where users need to sign into, all those systems that need some sort of password access. Concentrate on finding those networks and systems where deploying the multi-factor authentication will take more work. So for example, if you are using SAML, security assertion markup language, you want to be protecting those networks. And if you have discovered vulnerable apps that don't support anything except passwords because they use legacy or basic authentication, those are the ones you want to move to multi-factor authentication. And this includes older email systems that might be using IMAP4 or POP3 or SMTP. Also any of those older applications. And you might have to choose which applications to protect first. Also try to make it as easy as possible on your employees. Always choose MFA options that have less friction. So you might, for example, use biometrics on devices, or you might use FIDO2 compliant factors. It makes it easier for your employees. Try to avoid SMS authentications if you can, because those can be hugely problematic and are also quite easy to hack. Phone-based authentication apps like Microsoft Authenticator apps are an option, and they are particularly good because they don't require a handover of the device to anybody else. You're probably going to have to choose more than one MFA for your staff to use, because not everybody is comfortable, for example, with biometrics. They don't necessarily want their fingerprints, their faces to be recognized in company networks. And ensure that you also include mobile devices through MDM. Mobile devices are increasingly being used for work as well as personal use. Also, of course, have a support plan. You need to understand how you're going to handle failed sign-ins and account lockouts. And these aren't always because there's been a breach, it's because people sometimes make a mistake and simply type in the wrong password, or they authenticate incorrectly. If that happens, how do you restore access to your staff without keeping them locked out of the system for any length of time? And again, if you make it difficult for people and if you make it impossible for them to get back in when they've made a mistake, chances are they're going to find ways to circumvent the system. You also need a plan for lost devices. So what happens if you lose a security key, or indeed if an entire device is lost or misplaced? And then you need to measure and monitor any rollout to see the impact that it has on both security, which of course is what you're looking for. You want to see a positive impact there, but you also need to understand how it's affecting the productivity of your staff. If they're not as productive as they were before you've installed MFA, you need to rethink how you do it. Now, there are a number of multi-factor authenticator providers that you can look at. These are just the top ones by use. in 2021. We don't need to go through them in any detail. Just recognize that some of them are more basic, some have a lot more features, some are paid, and some are free. So Authy is a two-factor authentication solution, and it's particularly aimed at using of smartphones. So it's a really good one if your staff is doing a lot of their work on their phones. One login helps you to access applications and to secure those accessed applications and any tools that are in use behind a very secure firewall. And it also integrates very well with third-party solutions. Okta is a very innovative company, and they've come up with a really interesting multi-factor authentication tool for companies of all sizes. So if you're looking for something that goes into a lot of interesting features and that is quite simple to use, nevertheless, then Okta is one you might want to consider. RSA Secure ID Access has been created specifically for companies that have made the shift to the cloud. And as more of us are using those file sharing apps in the cloud, this is one that you might want to think about. And then there's Google Authenticator, which makes up the remainder of the top 5 from last year. It's a relatively easy one to install and use. It's lightweight, it's convenient, and it might not have all the features that you need, but it's certainly a very good starting point. And it's also good to note that Google's FIDO keys have never been breached. And that is a very important thing, particularly if you are using FIDO keys and you're making it easy for your staff to access different applications on your network. And then there are a range of others that you might want to look at as well. And we will be able to share these files with you, so you'll have access to all of those URLs. So the important thing that I want you to take away from today when it comes to passwords is a very simple password and MFA policy that you can take away and that you can implement as soon as you get out of today's webinar. The first part of that password policy must be that passwords must be at least 15 characters long. And if you cannot get staff to remember a 15-character password, get them to use a passphrase. Don't make passwords expire unless they are breached. The more times you get people to change the passwords, the more likely they are to make a mistake. So unless there's a breach, you really don't need to be changing your passwords all the time. Every password must use a minimum of 2 numbers or 2 special characters. You don't have to have numbers and special characters. It doesn't necessarily make the password stronger if you have both, but you must have at least 2 of each. And whenever it's available, you need to have mandatory use of multi-factor authentication. Now, an example of a passphrase, and this is something that anyone can remember, and they will choose any phrase that makes sense to them. In this case, my favorite date is 25 December. And you can see there that it's covered everything that you could possibly need, including the 15 characters. It's got 2 letters, and it also happens to have a special character. It's something that no one else is likely to crack, and it's something that could be unique to every single employee. So it could be my first child's name is Don and she was born on, for example. So anything that makes it easy for that password to be remembered. The passphrase much easier than a nonsensical list of characters. So moving now on to software updates rather. Software updates, of course, fix issues in software products, and that includes the installation of security patches. Now, hackers are very smart people, and they are always aware of vulnerabilities. They are also aware of when an update is about to occur, and they will target a device that hasn't been updated immediately before that update occurs. If one device in a network is compromised, the entire network is compromised, and I can't stress that enough. So an important part of reducing security vulnerabilities is to reduce software vulnerabilities by restricting which software people can install on their work devices and knowing what software people use on their personal devices for work. 77% of all attacks last year exploited gaps in software already installed on computers. Hackers monitor the update releases and they rapidly pounce on what the update is trying to fix. Updates, of course, do more than just plug security holes. They also keep your device working as it should, and that means efficiency is improved and there are minimized reasons to find workarounds which can compromise security. The immediately implementable software policy that you can take away today. Some organizational guidelines. Centralize all your software and installations and updates for company devices. Every single staff member should not be allowed to update their own software. Also curtail employees' ability to install or update software on company-owned devices. Everything needs to be centralized. No employee should be allowed to install any software on a company-owned device. Also monitor the software that employees use on their personal devices that connect into the organization's network or that have access to the organization's files. And this is a bit of a thorny one because there are privacy issues at play here, but this comes down to education. Your employees should not be allowed to install software on any device that they own if that device is going to connect into your network. And that means laptops, tablets, even smartphones that people have a tendency to charge in their desktops in the office. If it has access to company files, same thing, it has access to the network. Therefore, you need to restrict what is used on that machine. Also ensure that all employees are aware of the danger of potentially harmful software, such as games, etc. And also ensure that they are aware of suspect internet browsing habits. If your staff is browsing the internet on your device or on a device of their own that is connected into your network or has access to your files, and they are going to gambling sites, for example, or pornographic sites, which have their own issues, but many of those sites come with cookies that plant viruses. Ensure that all patches are installed all the time. And if you haven't installed them across the entire network, make sure that you install them for testing within 72 hours of every patch that is released for servers and infrastructure systems. And that includes things like routers. Also subscribe to all mailing list notification systems of existing vendors so that you know when the updates are coming and you know what is in those updates. And in the case of critical systems, you need to test the updates and patches before they are widely deployed. So test them in a controlled environment to understand what effects this can have on the whole network. You don't want to install a patch that could make a vital piece of software unserviceable and therefore affect some of your other networks. Also, on a quarterly basis, you need to scan and monitor all devices to ensure that appropriately released patches have been installed. Now, when it comes to your staff, software policy, instruct all employees to enable auto update on all devices. And this includes personal devices such as mobile phones and tablets that connect to your network. Instruct your employees that they are not allowed to ignore auto update notifications. We all ignore them because we think it's too annoying now to install something. You're in the middle of a piece of work, you're not going to do it. Employees shouldn't be allowed to do that. And once prompted, they have to install the update within 24 hours. So they can finish the current piece of work, but then install the update. And of course, this is on their own devices. On your devices, you've taken charge of that. But on their own devices, they need to install the updates too. And if they can't do it, they need to let you know. When selecting software in those cloud services for personal use, make sure your employees use vendors that have robust and effective policies around patching. Now, all employees must follow organizational guidelines, and they must ensure that antivirus software is updated regularly, and they shouldn't ignore any notices to scan devices. The third of our core four is phishing. Phishing, of course, comes in the form of email, phone calls, texts, and hackers then use tricks to get people to provide personal information or passwords or banking information. And of course, if that personal password gives access to a company network, then they've also given access to the company. In 2021, 52% of people clicked on a phishing email because it looked as though it had come from a senior executive in the company. And earlier today, we talked about why it is important that senior executives are protected from a password perspective and a multi-factor authentication perspective. Because if a senior executive is hacked and emails are sent as if they had come from their accounts, there's a very good chance that staff will react and react in a way that you do not want. So when it comes to phishing, and at the moment, there are a number of things going around that are particularly nasty, and many of those are around taxation because we've come to the end of a financial year. So staff is far more likely to open something that responds and relates to something that is occurring in their life at the moment. So instruct your employees that if an email is from an unknown sender, they should not provide any confidential company or personal information. They shouldn't take action by opening an attachment, by clicking on a link, or entering information in a pop-up box. If an email arrives from an unknown sender, these things should always be implemented. Doesn't matter where the email seems to come from. If it's unknown, staff or anybody in your organization should not click on links, enter information, or provide confidential information. If the email is from a known sender but it's out of character, they need to check the identity of the sender before clicking on any attachment in the email. And there are ways that you can see that address by hovering over it, for example. If you can't see the email address, then you have to assume that there is something nefarious. If it comes from somebody in the organization that is known and trusted, and it's asking for information that is out of character, check if it's come from that person. If it's using language that is not usually used by that person, you need to check to see if that person is in fact the one who sent the email. Maybe they were just in more of a hurry than usual and they used language that they wouldn't ordinarily use. Check first. If the email is asking for financial or confidential information about the business, or it's asking for confidential information like passwords, security keys, etc., call the sender and ask them, did you send me this? And why are you asking for this information? They will immediately say, I didn't send that information, or yes, I do need this and this is why I need it. If you do have a suspicious email, it needs to be brought to the attention of a superior, to an administrator, or if you do have that cyber leader in your organization, tell them. Take a screenshot of the suspicious email and send it in a new email message for review. Never forward a suspicious email because you're just multiplying the danger that can occur. So a very simple policy, but one that is very effective and very easy to implement. If it's from an unknown sender, don't send anything that is suspicious. If it's from a known sender and it's using language that doesn't seem in character, or if it's asking for information that seems out of character, call and ask that person if they sent the email. If an email ever asks for financial or confidential information, verify with the sender. And if there are any suspicious emails, don't forward them. Take a screenshot, send it in a new message and ask, does this look okay to you? Now, once you've implemented the policy, the best way to test what your staff knows and what they are likely to do in an unknown situation is to run a phishing simulation. So after you've implemented your phishing policy and you've educated your employees, you need to tell them that you'll be running a phishing simulation. You're not trying to trick them. You're trying to raise awareness and you're trying to identify security gaps. This isn't about making people do the wrong thing. This is about checking if they will. Make sure you've got someone who's willing to put in the time and effort to run the sim, because it can take a bit of time. And also make sure that you've got a big enough team that's willing to participate. If you've got a cyber leader, your cyber leader should be the person who leads this. And of course, they'll need support from your IT and your security people or your human resources department. And they'll also need permission from upper management before they can set up and run a company-wide phishing sim. Other things that you'll need is an email account that everyone uses at work, software that allows you to send out bulk emails, and of course, some really cool subject lines and content that will make users want to know more without being too suspicious. Before you start planning your simulation, you need to know why you're doing it. So what are you going to be testing? How does it align with your overall company mission and with your policies? Which emails should users recognize instantly as phishing versus scam ones and versus real ones? Which are the ones that they should be able to identify, in other words, as a little bit suspect? And how are you going to be testing and what are you going to be testing? Is it how quickly employees identify and report the emails? Or is it the actual click rates on them? So you need to determine what you're testing. And some of the things that you might want to consider testing for a phishing test: the number of emails that actually opened, the number of email clicks on those suspicious links, users that might have gone even further and actually entered credentials or downloaded a file, the number of users that reported the email, and the number of users that completed training after they got that email. And then things that you do on a regular basis, you need to test the results month over month to see how the awareness level has risen and what sort of trend lines you see, and of course those open and click rates over time. Now you're going to need a phishing simulation tool, and they're not all the same. So get one that works for your company and that's easy to use. Lots and lots of different ones out there, and we'll look at a couple of them in a moment. But some of the things you need to ask when you're choosing that tool: what platforms does the phishing simulation support? Is it browser-based, or is it something that you have to install? What type of reporting capabilities does it have? How many employees can it train at once? How many phishing templates does it have? Because if it only has one or two, probably going to be quite easy to recognize. Can you provide additional training using an LMS? Can employees self-report phishing emails? What happens when a user fails? And can you also simulate spear phishing attacks? Now, those are ones that are targeted, so they're not just general phishing emails that go out, but ones that are targeted to specific people with specific language. And here are a couple that you might want to think about. There's InfoSec IQ, which also includes a free phishing risk test that allows you to launch a SIM campaign automatically and get your phish rate in 24 hours. And then there's GoPhish, which is an open source phishing platform supported by most operating systems. And all you have to do is download and extract a zip folder. And there, as I say, any number of others, and happy to point you in the direction of some more if you'd like to know a few others that you can look at. Now, the final link in our chain of 4 is USBs and file sharing. And I know that after our first session, a number of you have already junked your USBs, which is a really good outcome. So USBs, of course, removable media that can store and transfer files from one device to another. We talk about USBs because they're the most commonly used, but it can also be external hard drives if you've got a lot of information. USBs, frequent targets of malicious actors, and they can infect your computer without you even realizing until it's way too late to do anything about it. And file sharing can be any number of different sharing devices, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But generally these days we're talking about cloud-based file sharing. It is more secure than USBs, but you do need rules around it to ensure that there are checks and balances in place before files are uploaded and downloaded. Now, Honeywell tells us that 37% of all cybersecurity threats last year were designed to use removable media, and that is double what it was in 2020, which means it's just going to keep increasing exponentially. Many businesses are using file sharing now. 39% of business data that is uploaded to the cloud is used for file sharing purposes. The average company shares files with over 800 different online domains, and that includes partners and vendors. You can imagine that that in itself is fraught when it comes to access of those files. About 60% of all files that were uploaded to a file sharing service are never actually shared with other people. They're used as backup copies of those files. And that, of course, changes the way in which they're used. And about 70% of all shared files are spread to only internal users in an organization. Now, there are a number of different file sharing options. The original one is the FTP, the File Transfer Protocol. It was invented for moving huge amounts of data across networks. So, for example, if you've got voice files or video files, very often they will be transferred via FTP because they can take a large amount of data. Very often used for legacy data as well, and you can see some of the program examples there. Peer-to-peer is all about removing the need for a central server that hosts the data, and instead individual clients connect to a distributed network of peers. And this is particularly good for sharing files amongst a small group of people and files that are unavailable in public repositories. And again, you can see some of the programs that are commonly used. Of course, what we use most commonly is the next two: cloud services, where you upload your information to a central repository, and then other users can download the files to their own devices. All data is hosted by a third-party provider, but users can generally specify what types of permission levels to put on the files. It's fast, it's quick, it's efficient. You can create backups of data that way. And of course, the most commonly used ones that we know of are iCloud, Dropbox, and OneDrive. And then there's email. We tend not to often think of this, but every time you attach a document to an outgoing message, you're transferring that data over an open internet. And that is a very potentially dangerous thing to do. Very useful for small files, for data that needs explanation. So you explain the story behind it in the email body and you attach the file. And of course, there's Gmail, Outlook, and any number of others. Very important that any information that is sent that way is the sort of information that is not confidential, or if it is intercepted, is not going to cause access into your network. So don't send passwords and banking information attached to emails ever. So let's look now at that easily implementable and immediately implementable policies that you can take away today. The first one is around USBs. Prohibit the use of USBs, so don't allow them. No USBs and removable media devices by employees, except in rare circumstances, and we'll look at the rare circumstances and the guidelines around those in a moment. Any removable media devices that are currently in use must be discontinued immediately, and they have to be scanned before transferring any files that they contain to the cloud for storage. Now, what are the exception case guidelines? All USBs, including brand new ones that you get straight out of the pack, must be scanned by a designated IT person on a computer not connected to the network. And this is to ensure that no malicious code is present. Very important, scanned on a device that is not connected to the network. Only employees who find themselves routinely in a situation where they need to share information with a trusted party without access to a secure network should be allowed to use USBs provided they get pre-approval and they use a pre-scanned device. So in the case of an organization like ours, for example, where people are very often going off-site to deliver presentations, they'll take that presentation with them on a USB. That is allowed provided permission is granted and the USB is checked before it comes into contact with the network. Once the device has been used off-site, it should be disposed of, or at the very least, it must be scanned by a device not connected to the network before it's reused. So that USB was scanned, you put your presentation on it, you took it off-site, you put it into somebody else's device, you bring it back to the office. You don't just put it straight back into a device that is connected to the network because you don't know what might have been planted on that device while it was in the other computer. This one seems a no-brainer, but it's actually remarkable how many of us do this. We've all been to trade shows and been handed USBs as freebies. You should never, ever use that USB. Doesn't matter where it comes from, don't accept a USB received from an unverified party. Trade shows, vendors, picked up in a parking lot, and trust me, I've seen people do that. Never use it. Have it scanned, not on a device that is connected to the network, and if it's okay, it might be used, but it's better just not to use it at all. Now, some file sharing policies that you can implement immediately. First of all, your employees should use file sharing applications and secure email encryption to share and store all files. Also, make sure that no confidential information is sent via email as an attachment. Choose a file sharing application that offers end-to-end encryption because that will protect you from external hackers, and it will also prevent the host of that service itself from viewing your data. Always double check permission settings. Most services will allow for a public sharing option, but that of course means that anybody that has the right link can also upload your files and download them. So make sure that you have very strong permission settings. And then regularly run audits on your files to see who is accessing them. That way you'll pick up if somebody has got unauthorized access. And if a file isn't needed, remove it from the cloud system entirely. Don't just have stuff sitting up there for the sake of it being there. So that's the core four. And if you implement those very simple policies immediately, you will stave off most of the attacks that will come your way, because those core four issues are the ones that most often open the door to cyber attacks. Remember, the four core, all four are connected. They connected each to the other, and they connected as a unit. So in the case of a business email compromise, for example, an attacker takes over your email service via your cloud-based file storage. It's able then to send phishing emails using your accounts. You get a phishing email from your boss asking you to click on a link or to send a password. You do that because it's your boss. The attacker gains access to the company's files, and launches a ransomware attack. And of course, last time round, we talked at some length about ransomware and exactly the dangers of that. The Core Four apply to everyone, to every employee and contractor in your organization, all levels, all roles, all functions, to every device used to access the organization's networks and data. That includes company-issued computers, tablets, and the like, company-issued smartphones, personal computers that are used to access the network or to access the files, and personal smartphones and tablets that are used for work. If it can access the network or access your files, it's treated like a work device. We talked before about prioritizing your risk. I just want to recap that. You need to understand in your own organization which systems and data are the most important for you to protect. And then you need to identify the most likely ways those systems and that data could be lost or damaged. Determine what's going to cause you the most damage, whether it's damage from data loss or public release of data, or damage from systems being down for days or weeks, so loss of business continuity through ransomware. Evaluate the financial costs, the recovery costs, and the reputational damage, and prioritize what you protect first accordingly. In the case of data loss, we're talking about business information, customer information, trade secrets, confidential employee information, including things like health records, etc., personal health information, personally identifiable information. And business continuity, we're talking about websites going down and not being accessible, particularly important if yours is an e-commerce business, service and product delivery, purchase order processing, payroll processing. If you can't pay your staff's not going to be very happy with you. Payment processing, if you can't be paid, of course, email and communications. Which of those are most important to you to protect? Prioritize those and then progressively protect everything else afterwards. And that's brought us to the end of today's session. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box, and I'll take them now. And just a reminder that we have one more webinar in this series to come, and that's 2 weeks from today on the 2nd of August. And then we're going to be looking at how you create an incident response plan. So you can do everything you possibly can to take care of cyber readiness. There's a very good chance that there will still be some sort of breach in your organization. How do you deal with that breach? How do you create the incident response plan? How do you react to that breach? How do you recover from that breach? And what are your obligations under the law to tell other people in your network and in your supply chain that you have been breached so that they can act accordingly? As I said, happy to take any questions. And if you don't think of any questions now, you are more than welcome to send me your questions after today's session. You will be getting a follow-up from Zoom just to say thank you for attending, and my email address will be in that email that you get. So while you're thinking, if you have any questions, just a reminder of some of the other great things that we have coming up at the Victoria Met's Export Hub. Starting on the 4th of August, of course, is our Capability Accelerator program. And we're starting off with a really great series on market selection and how you make sure that you choose the appropriate market for your business, your product, your service. And you can see the address there to register. And then on the 17th of August, we're going to start off with a cyber roadshow. And yes, questions just come through. You will be able to get a copy of the presentation. So you'll have copies of all these URLs and so on as well. So the Cyber Roadshow kicks off on the 17th of August in Geelong, and we're also going to Ballarat, to Bendigo, and to the Latrobe Valley. So if you have colleagues who you'd like to get some hands-on face-to-face cyber training, that's a really good way to do it, to come along to the roadshow. You're welcome, Mark. So any other questions, as I say, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. Just want to remind you of some really great Austmine events that are coming up as well, starting off with the GMG forum that is being held on the 17th and 18th of August in Perth, and you can go to the Austmine website to register for that. Please do register for it. You'll find there's a really great panel of speakers and you'll be able to see them all on the website. IMARC, of course, is coming up as well in November of this year. And remember, there's been a slight change of dates for IMARC and also change in location. So again, you can see the address there to register for IMARC. And just a reminder that the early bird offer for IMARC ends on the 22nd of July. So you only have a few more days to avail yourself of that early bird offer, which is a really good one. And then the final event that I'd like to draw your attention to, and you can register for it now, so it's very exciting for us, is Austmine 23. So you'll see the address there, but if you just go to the Austmine website, you'll be able to follow the links and you can register for Austmine 23 that is happening in Adelaide in May of next year. Doesn't look as if we've got any other questions. So all that remains is to point you in the direction of the Austmine website, where you'll find information on all the events I've already mentioned and a host of other great things that are coming up over the next few weeks and months. So please do go along to the website and avail yourself of all of those great events. All that remains is for me to say thank you very much for coming along today and for your attention. It's a pleasure as always to have you on board, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. And of course, that next session is where we are going to be looking at that all-important incident response plan. So all that remains is to say thank you very much, and for all of you, go along, have a great afternoon, and I do hope that you're all going to be a lot more cyber aware than you were when we started this series. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and goodbye.